Okay, so welcome back to this next lesson. This lesson will be short and sweet. We'll continue with what is risk management. And so we have our definition from the previous lesson, the systematic application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the tasks of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risks. So we can see it's kind of a step-by-step process, and these are the major elements of it. So we're going to walk through this just with a bit of an example to help you gain a more intuitive grasp of what exactly do we mean. So the first thing that we do here is we analyze risk. So you saw that in the previous example. That was things like the AED has internal electronics. And then by looking at that, we were able to establish that there is a fire risk. And then what did we do? Or we didn't actually do it, but what we should do when we say we're analyzing risk is, if you remember, risk is, we describe it both by its probability of occurrence and the severity of harm. So then what we do is we describe it as this is likely and severe. Okay, so that's what is meant by analysis. When it comes to evaluation, we basically look at that risk and we say, is it acceptable or unacceptable to live with this risk? So here we would say this is unacceptable. And another key part of this, and it's a huge mistake that people always make when they first apply the principles of risk management, is that when you look back at your device here, this is just a previous lecture, we have to assume when we first analyze risk that no risk control measures have been introduced. So when we're looking at the risk of fire, we have to assume that we have not yet designed the device to be using plastics or a PCB or any other components with flammability ratings. So then we say this risk is acceptable after we introduce the risk control measures, and that was, as you saw on the previous slide, we'll say therefore materials shall have a certain flammability rating. That's also an example of where ISO 14971 gets basically cross-linked with other standards like IEC 60601, because that's where you'll put in that plastics or PCBs or whatnot have flammability ratings. The next piece of this puzzle is we want to evaluate the overall risk. So then essentially we ask the question again, is this acceptable? And here we'll say this is now acceptable. Here we're going to end up saying that mainly because if you design the materials to have a certain flammability rating and you go down the path of it shall comply with IEC 60601, you can say that you're meeting a consensus standard, and then it's just going to be basically assumed that this risk is now acceptable. That may not always be the path. You may introduce risk control measures that are additional product requirements or software requirements that aren't coming from any consensus standard, and then you just want expert opinion, which is going to be you're going to get from your risk management review, that the risk control measure was adequate to bring the risk to an acceptable level. Okay, so this is now acceptable. The other question that we're going to want to ask here is, do benefits outweigh risks? We always want to weigh those up because maybe the risk is still unacceptable, but the benefits outweigh the risks. And the very last step to process, of course, after evaluating the overall residual risk, just the remaining risk, is we do a risk management review. And what we want in the risk management review, this is at the end when you've looked at many risks and you've implemented many risk controls, you're going to want an independent review. And what you want there is just somebody who understands risk management, who is themselves a risk management expert, as you will be after you have gone through this course, and they're independent in the fact that they were not primarily involved with the application of the risk management in this design. They didn't conduct the risk assessments. And it might be helpful as well to also bring in a person with a clinical background that understands the clinical and use risks better than engineers, but you do want a kind of mixture because when it comes to risk management, it is very interdisciplinary. You're going to want an electronic engineer to talk you through the flammability stuff and anything related to IEC 60601. And for any software related risks, you're going to want a software developer, etc. So that's the independent review. You want them to not have worked on risk management, but be subject matter experts. And the other thing that we really want to ask ourselves here is risk management complete? And there's two big parts to asking, is risk management complete? And that is, have you identified all the risks? Or I could say there all the hazards. And the other thing that we want to ensure is that our risk control measures effective. Okay, generally our evidence that risk control measures are effective is going to be testing. So if you want to prove that all the risk control measures in your user manual are effective, you're going to want simulated use testing where you have people actually following the instructions and trying to use the device. It's not always going to be testing, say that's validation testing. It can also be product verification testing, design verification testing, or in this case, it'll just be checking that the materials you use have suitable flammability ratings because they were tested once off to prove that they have that flammability rating, etc. Now, the other thing that I might point out here is risk control measures. Say we introduce this risk control measure of the material shall have a certain flammability rating. The normal way that people end up implementing risk control measures just to get the process going is you add basically new requirements, but not always. There's always exceptions to this rule. Okay, and I think I will leave that there, and I shall see you in the next lesson.